The Tuesday morning sun came through the museum's tall windows pale and watery, the way light does in late autumn when nothing in the world feels warm. Outside on the lawn, 2 men in their early 30s, the older one in a navy polo with a brass name tag that said Nathan, the younger in a khaki vest stitched with the museum logo, stood beside a battered Sherman tank talking to a small group of visitors who had just rolled up in a minivan from the highway. "Training hull," Nathan said, slapping the cold steel of the sponson with his open palm like a man slapping the rump of a cow. "Never saw combat. Used at Fort Knox in 1943 to teach gunnery. Mothballed after the war. Donated to us in 78. The records are very clear." A woman in the group asked something, and Nathan smiled the practiced smile of a docent who had answered the same question 200 times. "No, Mum. We get this all the time. Folks see the patches and figure she's a veteran, but every single Sherman has welded patches. That's just where they cut access holes during refits. Doesn't mean a thing." Nobody noticed the old man on the bench by the parking lot. He was 79 years old in a worn olive field jacket too big for his shoulders, with a maple cane resting between his knees and a paper cup of bad museum coffee going cold in his hand. He had heard every word. He did not move, he did not speak. He simply lowered his cup slowly to the bench beside him, closed his eyes for a long moment, and breathed out through his nose the way old soldiers do when they are deciding whether to say something or let it pass. If you have ever watched somebody you love be misjudged, type respect in the comments before this story goes any further, because this old man was about to teach 2 museum volunteers, 1 curator, and 47 Tuesday visitors a lesson about that very word. His name was Walter Coleman, and he had not planned on saying anything that morning. He had only come to the museum because his wife of 51 years, Margaret, had passed in March, and Tuesdays had been their day. The grocery, the diner on Route 9 for pie, and sometimes, when the weather was bad, this little regional military museum tucked into the edge of an old county fairground. Walter was a quiet man. He had been a high school shop teacher for 34 years. His students remembered him as patient, soft-spoken, and prone to long silences when he was thinking. They did not know he had been a tanker in the United States Army. They did not know that he had enlisted at 18 in 1943, trained at Fort Knox, shipped out with the 712th Tank Battalion, and crossed half of Europe inside a steel coffin that had heated like a stove in summer and frozen his hands to the radio set in winter. He never spoke of it. Not to his students, not to his children. Once, only once to Margaret, on the night of their 20th anniversary, when she had asked him gently why he never wore short sleeves even in July. He had shown her the burn scars that ran from his right wrist to his shoulder, and he had told her in 3 short sentences what had happened on the morning of December 23rd, 1944. And then he had never spoken of it again. He had not come to the museum that day looking for his tank. He had come for the silence. But the moment he had limped out of his old Buick and seen her sitting there on the concrete pedestals, paint peeling, road wheels missing, gun rusted to nothing, his heart had stopped in his chest the way a clock stops when its mainspring breaks. He had known her instantly. He could not have told you how. The hull number was painted over. The bumper codes were gone. The serial plates were missing or sanded smooth. But a man knows the inside of his own house in the dark, and Walter Coleman had lived inside that tank for 173 days. He had slept against her transmission for warmth. He had bled on her floor plates. He had dragged the body of his bowgunner, a kid from Pittsburgh named Eddie Maslin, who had just turned 19, through her rear escape hatch in the snow outside a town called Loutrebois. He had walked away from her on the morning of December 23rd, 1944, certain in his bones that he would never see her again. And now here she was, 56 years later, on a lawn in a small town in the middle of nowhere, with 2 men in polo shirts telling tourists she had never seen a fight. He waited until Nathan and the younger volunteer had led the minivan group inside toward the gift shop. Then he stood, leaning on his cane, and walked slowly across the gravel toward her. He did not look at the placard. He did not look at the rusted gun. He went directly, as a man walks toward a grave he has visited 100 times in dreams, to the right sponson, just behind the bowgunner's hatch, at hip height. He laid his palm on the steel. The metal was so cold it burned. He let it burn, and then, with the slow, painful effort of a body that no longer bent the way it had at 20, Walter Coleman lowered himself onto one knee beside the tank, and he found with his fingers the irregular 6-inch patch of darker steel that had been welded into the armour in a field workshop in Bastogne in late January of 1945 by a maintenance sergeant named Curtis Holloway, who had since died in a nursing home in Tucson. Walter ran his thumb along the weld bead. The bead was bad. Holloway had always done bad welds. They used to joke about it. The bead was unmistakable. Walter's hand began to shake. He stayed on his knee for a long time. He was crying without sound, the way old men cry when they have nobody left to cry to. When he finally stood, using the cane and the side of the tank to lever himself up, he wiped his face with the cuff of the field jacket and limped back toward the museum doors, with his jaw set in a way none of his students, and very few of his children, would have recognized. The curator's name was Dr. Rachel Pham. She was 41, 2 years into the job, with a PhD in public history from Penn State, and a habit of taking her lunch at her desk so she could keep working. She looked up when Walter knocked softly on the open door of her office, expecting a question about the restroom or the price of a souvenir patch. What she saw instead was an elderly man with red eyes and a hand that would not stop trembling, asking her, very politely, very quietly, if she would please bring him the original donation paperwork for the Sherman on the front lawn. "Sir," she began gently, "the volunteers can answer most questions about—" "No, ma'am." His voice was soft, but it stopped her cold. "They cannot. Your volunteers told that family out there that my tank never saw combat. I would like to see the paperwork, please, and then I would like, if you have a moment, to tell you where my tank actually was on the morning of December 23rd, 1944, and what hit her, and why that patch under the radio seat is the only reason I'm standing here this morning instead of buried in a field outside Loutre Bois with the rest of my crew." Dr. Pham did not speak for several seconds. Then, without taking her eyes off the old man, she reached for her keys, walked past him into the records room and came back with a thin manila folder marked Sherman M4A3/donated 1978/Provenance FT Knox Training. She opened it on the desk between them. The paperwork was exactly 4 pages long. It listed the tank as a Fort Knox training hull, mothballed in 1946, transferred to a National Guard armory in Ohio in 1958, and donated to the museum in 1978 by a private collector who had bought her at a surplus auction. There was no combat record. There was no battalion designation. There was no crew roster. Walter looked at the 4 pages for a long time. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his field jacket and took out a small soft leather wallet, the leather worn shiny at the corners from 50 years of carrying. From the wallet he took a folded piece of paper, brittle along the creases, and laid it on top of the donation forms. It was a hand-drawn diagram, in pencil, of a Sherman M4A3 hull, with a small X marked at the right sponson under the bow gunner's seat, and underneath it, in the careful, blocky handwriting of an Army maintenance sergeant, the words, "Patched January 27, 1945, Holloway, 712th, Tank BN, Serial 301-19547. Below that, in different handwriting, Walter's own, the date December 23rd, 44 and 3 names, Maslin, Petrosky, DiCarlo. The first name was crossed out. The other 2 were not. Dr. Pham looked at the diagram. She looked at the donation paperwork. She looked at the old man. And then, with hands that had begun to tremble almost as much as his, she picked up the phone on her desk and asked the front desk to please ask Nathan and the other volunteer to come to her office immediately, and to please bring the small group of Tuesday visitors with them. What happened next did not happen quickly. Walter Coleman was not a man who hurried, and he was not a man who showboated. When Nathan walked into the curator's office and saw the old veteran sitting in the visitor's chair with a hand-drawn diagram on the desk, Nathan's face went through a sequence of expressions. First puzzlement, then a flicker of irritation, then something else, slower and more uncomfortable as he registered that the curator was standing rather than sitting, and that her hands were folded the way a person folds her hands when she is preparing to apologize. Walter did not raise his voice. He did not even look at Nathan at first. He simply asked, in the same soft tone he had used with his shop students for 34 years, whether the museum had a larger room they could use, because he thought perhaps the visitors out front might want to hear this too, by the time Dr. Pham led them all into the small reading room at the back of the museum. Nathan, the younger volunteer, the family from the minivan, 2 retirees who had wandered in off the parking lot, a school librarian, and an off-duty sheriff's deputy named Ramirez who had stopped in for coffee. There were 14 people in the chairs and another 8 standing along the back wall. Walter sat at the head of the room with his cane across his knees and the diagram on the table in front of him, and he began to speak. He told them about the morning of December 23rd, 1944, when the fog had finally broken over the Ardennes and the air boys could fly again, and Combat Command B of the 4th Armoured had pushed north out of Ireland toward Bastogne. He told them about Eddie Maslin, the bow gunner, 19 years old, from a row house in Pittsburgh, who had carried a photograph of his sister taped inside his helmet. He told them about Sergeant Petrosky, the gunner, and Corporal DiCarlo, the loader, and Lieutenant Hollis Brennan, the commander, who had been 23. He told them about himself, 20 years old, the driver, with frostbitten fingers wrapped around the steering laterals and a mug of cold coffee wedged between his knees. He told them about the village of Loutrebois and the German Volksgrenadiers hidden in the second-story windows of a stone farmhouse, and the soft thump whoosh of a Panzerfaust being fired from 20 metres away. He told them how the shaped charge had punched through the right sponson at exactly the height of Eddie Maslin's chest, and how the molten jet had killed Eddie instantly, and how the spall, the cloud of white-hot steel fragments that came off the inside of the armour, had filled the fighting compartment like a swarm of hornets. He told them how DiCarlo had pulled him out through the driver's hatch with his right sleeve on fire. He told them how Brennan had gone back in for Eddie and had not come out. He told them how Petrosky had died 3 days later in a field hospital in Arlen, of wounds Walter had not even known he had taken, because Petrosky had not said a word about them while he was helping Walter into the ambulance. He told them that Sergeant Holloway's maintenance section had recovered the tank a week later, patched the hole in a frozen field workshop in Bastogne with a piece of scrap armour cut from a wrecked Sherman they had towed in from Neuville, and put her back into service on January 27th, 1945, with a new crew Walter had never met. He told them he had spent 4 months in a hospital in England, and he had assumed, the way young men assume things, that the tank had been scrapped after the war. And he told them, looking at Nathan now for the first time, that he had walked onto the lawn that morning and heard a young man slap her side and call her a training hull, and something in him that had been quiet for 56 years had stood up and said no. Nathan did not speak. The younger volunteer was crying quietly into his sleeve. Deputy Ramirez had taken off his ball cap and was holding it against his chest the way men used to hold their hats during the national anthem. Dr. Pham had her phone out and was very quietly recording. When Walter finished, the room was silent for what felt like a long time. Then Deputy Ramirez stood up, walked across the reading room, and held out his hand. "Sir," he said, "my grandfather was 4th Armoured, Combat Command A. He never came home. I have been a deputy in this county for 16 years, and I have driven past that tank on that lawn 3 times a week, and I never once stopped to look. I am sorry." Walter took his hand. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Within an hour, Dr. Pham had emailed photographs of the diagram, the serial number, and the welded patch to a contact at the Army Heritage and Education Centre in Carlisle. Within 3 hours, she had a phone call back from a retired colonel named James Brennan, Lieutenant Hollis Brennan's nephew, a man who had spent 20 years trying to find the tank his uncle had died in. Colonel Brennan was on a flight by Wednesday morning. He arrived at the museum on Thursday afternoon in his Class A uniform, with a folder of unit records and a small American flag that had flown over the Bastogne Memorial in 1994. He walked across the lawn to the tank and he stopped, and he saluted her. Then he walked into the museum and found Walter Coleman sitting in the reading room, and he saluted him too. They sat together for 3 hours. Nobody disturbed them. By Friday evening, the placard on the lawn had been taken down. By the following Tuesday, a new one was being printed. M4A3 Sherman, 712th Tank Battalion, attached 4th Armoured Division, combat damaged, December 23rd, 1944, Loutrebois, Belgium, Battle of the Bulge, her crew, Brennan, Petrosky, DiCarlo, Maslin, Coleman. Nathan asked Dr. Pham if he could write the new placard himself. He brought a draft to Walter's house on a Saturday morning, sat at the kitchen table, and asked the old tanker to please correct anything he'd gotten wrong. Walter corrected 1 word. They sat together for 2 hours after that, drinking bad coffee, and Nathan asked questions and Walter answered them, in the soft tone of a shop teacher, explaining a lathe to a student who finally wanted to learn. The volunteers at that museum still tell visitors about the Sherman on the front lawn. They do not call her a training hull anymore. They tell people her name was Margaret, after the driver's wife, and they tell people about the morning of December 23rd, 1944, and about the 4 men who did not come home, and about the one who did. And on the bench by the parking lot, on Tuesday mornings, you will sometimes find an old man in a worn olive field jacket sitting with a paper cup of bad coffee going cold in his hand, watching school children walk past the tank with their teachers and reach up, very carefully, very respectfully, to touch the welded patch under the bowgunner's seat. Some tanks are training hulls, others are tombstones with engines that just happen to drive their crews home alive, and every single one of them, every single Sherman, every single Pershing, every single Patton and Abrams and tanker who ever crawled inside one, deserves to be looked at twice before being dismissed. If this story moved you, if you believe that the silent ones at the back of the room are usually the ones who paid the most for the room to exist, subscribe to this channel, because we tell the stories the paperwork was never going to tell. Comment on or below for Walter Coleman, for Eddie Maslin, for Hollis Brennan, for Petrosky and DiCarlo, and for every old man on every bench in every small town who is still, quietly, carrying his tank home.